Before the flood, according to the Book of Enoch, the giants were not an accident of nature. They were built through a forbidden union, not merely born, made possible. The text says, heavenly beings called watchers descended to earth, crossed a boundary between the divine and the human, and produced a race of giants who filled the world with violence. In Genesis, the story appears in only a few strange verses. In Enoch, it becomes an entire investigation. The mystery begins in a world of cold mountains, stone altars, and names carved into memory. A world where ancient writers tried to explain why the earth had become corrupt before the waters came. But historians still debate what this story means. Was it a myth about fallen angels? A warning against forbidden knowledge? A memory of ancient warrior kings? Or a symbolic explanation for violence before civilization collapsed before this video ends? We will follow 3 discoveries. First, what Enoch actually says about who created the giants. Second, why Mount Hermon became central to the story. And third, why this forbidden tradition survived outside the Bible for more than 2,000 years. The oldest layer of the mystery begins with a sentence that seems almost too brief for the weight it carries. Ancient text, Genesis 6 says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves." Then it adds that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. That is all Genesis gives us before the flood narrative begins to gather force. The passage is short. It is compressed. It almost feels like a fragment from a much larger story. And that is exactly why the Book of Enoch became so important. Most readers stop at Genesis, but Enoch keeps going. In the Book of the Watchers, usually dated by scholars to the 3rd century BCE, the story opens like a dossier. The scene is not a palace, not a battlefield, not a city. It is a mountain, high, cold, and remote, a place where wind scrapes against stone, where cloud shadows move across the ridges, and where men below would have seen the summit as a boundary between earth and sky. Ancient text. Enoch says that a group of angels, called watchers, saw human women and desired them. Their leader, Shemi-Hazah, feared the others would abandon the plan and leave him guilty alone. So they swore an oath together. They descended on Mount Hermon. Then the text gives the mountain a meaning. Hermon becomes the place of the oath, the place where the boundary was crossed. Historical evidence. Mount Hermon stands near the northern edge of ancient Israel's world, rising above the borderlands of Lebanon, Syria, and the Golan Heights. It is snow-capped in winter. It dominates the horizon. In antiquity, high places were often associated with divine presence, sacred encounters, and territorial borders. So when Enoch places the watchers there, it is not random geography. It is a symbolic landscape, a mountain between worlds. But the next passage changes everything. Ancient text. Enoch says the watchers took wives, went into them, and taught them forbidden arts. Then the women conceived and bore giants. The text does not describe giants as a natural tribe that simply wandered into history. It gives them an origin. It presents them as the result of a violation, a crossing of categories that should have remained separate. Mainstream scholarly view. Many scholars understand this passage as an expansion of Genesis 6. It takes a mysterious biblical reference and develops it into a full myth of angelic rebellion. The story explains why the world before the flood became violent enough to require judgment. But what does it mean to say the giants were built not with hammers, not with bronze tools, not in a workshop? They were built by transgression. They were created when desire, power, and forbidden knowledge were joined together. That is the first clue. The giants in Enoch are not merely large bodies. They are the visible result of a broken cosmic order. Possible interpretation. Ancient readers may have seen these beings as a warning. When heavenly knowledge enters human society without moral restraint, the result is not enlightenment. It is domination, violence, appetite without limit. And Enoch makes that point in brutal detail. Ancient text. The giants consume the produce of human labor. When humanity can no longer sustain them, the giants turn against human beings. Then they begin to devour animals, birds, reptiles, fish, and finally, one another. The story becomes ecological. The land cannot bear them. The food supply collapses. The created order begins to eat itself. What comes next is even stranger. The Watchers do not only produce giants, they teach. Azazel teaches humans to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He shows them metals of the earth, ornaments, cosmetics, and the art of beautifying the eyelids. Other Watchers teach enchantments, root cuttings, astrology, the signs of the stars, and the courses of the moon. At first, this sounds like civilization, weapons, metallurgy, adornment, astronomy, medicine. But Enoch frames these gifts as corrupting knowledge, historical evidence. In the ancient Near East, specialized knowledge was often treated as sacred. Metalworking, divination, astronomy, and healing were not ordinary skills. They belonged to temple systems, priestly classes, scribes, and royal experts. Knowledge was power, and power had to be controlled. So when Enoch says angels gave secret knowledge to humanity, it is describing a crisis of authority. Who has the right to teach dangerous things? Who decides when human beings are ready? And what happens when knowledge arrives before wisdom? This is where historians disagree. Some scholars read the Watcher's story as a critique of Hellenistic culture, where new sciences, luxury goods, military technologies, and foreign ideas were spreading through the Eastern Mediterranean. Others see older Mesopotamian influences behind it, especially stories of divine beings, Apkallu sages, and semi-divine figures from before the flood. The details are not identical, but the atmosphere is familiar. A world before catastrophe, superhuman teachers, forbidden arts, a flood that resets history. The Book of Enoch takes these ancient patterns and turns them into a moral investigation. Mainstream scholarly view. In Enoch, the crime of the Watchers is not only sexual, it is intellectual and social. They corrupt human society by producing violent giants and by revealing knowledge that accelerates disorder. That matters because the giants are not isolated monsters. They are the consequence of a system where spiritual beings violate boundaries. Humans receive dangerous instruction. Violence spreads, and the earth itself cries out. Ancient text. Enoch says the earth brought accusation against the lawless ones. The cries of human beings rose up to heaven. The archangels looked down and saw bloodshed covering the earth. This is one of the most cinematic moments in the text. Below, the world is dark with violence. Fields are emptied. Villages are afraid. Smoke rises from places that should have been homes. Above, the heavenly court observes the damage, not as rumor, not as legend, as evidence. The next detail is rarely discussed. The giants themselves are not treated as fully human. They are also not treated as fully angelic. They stand between categories. Their bodies belong to earth, but their origin points upward. This is why their destruction creates another problem. Ancient text. When the giants die, Enoch says their spirits go out from their bodies and become evil spirits upon the earth. In other words, killing the giants does not completely end the damage. Their violence survives in another form. Possible interpretation. This may explain why the Watcher's story became so powerful in later Jewish and Christian imagination. It did not only answer where giants came from, it also offered an origin story for demonic forces, human corruption, and the persistence of evil after judgment. But there is another layer. The giants are born before the flood, but their memory survives after it. That survival creates a problem for readers of Genesis. Numbers later describes the Anakim as giants. Deuteronomy mentions the Rephaim. Ancient Israelite tradition remembers tall, terrifying peoples in the land. Goliath of Gath stands as a later giant figure in the biblical imagination. Historical evidence. Archaeology does not confirm a race of supernatural giants. Skeletal evidence does not support the idea of enormous pre-flood beings walking the ancient Near East. What archaeology does show is that ancient societies often used giant language to describe feared enemies, legendary ancestors, and warrior elites. Large size could be literal. It could also be political. A giant might mean more than height. It might mean power, memory, terror, a people made larger by story. The evidence becomes more complicated because Enoch is not trying to produce a modern biological report. It is writing in an ancient symbolic world. Mountains can mark divine boundaries. Blood can accuse the guilty. Stars can disobey their courses. Spirits can explain the invisible pressure of evil in human life. Yet the story remains precise in one essential claim. The giants came from the Watchers. They were the offspring of forbidden descent. They were the embodied result of knowledge and desire breaking through a sacred wall. And this raises the question that drives the rest of the mystery. If Genesis preserves only the shadow of this story, and Enoch preserves the full forbidden version, then what did ancient readers think had really happened before the flood? Were they remembering monsters? Were they condemning empires? Were they explaining evil? Or were they preserving a tradition older and stranger than the Bible itself chose? To say plainly, the twist begins with something easy to miss. The Book of Enoch does not survive as one simple book, copied neatly through history. It survives like a shattered archive. Fragments in Aramaic, translations in Greek, a full version preserved in Ge'ez by the Ethiopian tradition. And inside that broken transmission, the story of the giants becomes more complicated. Ancient text. In the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, the Watchers descend, take human wives, and father giants. The account sounds direct, physical, almost brutally literal. But the ancient manuscript trail does not allow us to treat the text as a single flat surface. Historical evidence. Fragments of the Book of the Watchers were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. These Aramaic fragments show that parts of Enoch were circulating in Jewish communities before the time of Jesus. This matters because Enoch was not a medieval invention. It belonged to the world of Second Temple Judaism, the same broad religious atmosphere that shaped many later biblical interpretations. But another manuscript tradition shifts the angle. A related work called the Book of Giants, also found in fragmentary form at Qumran, expands the story from the viewpoint of the giants themselves. That changes everything. In this tradition, the giants are not just monsters seen from the outside. They dream. They fear judgment. They receive warnings. Their names appear in broken fragments, including figures such as Oya and Haya. The surviving pieces are damaged, but the tone is unmistakable. The giants know something is coming. Mainstream scholarly view. Scholars generally treat the Book of Giants as part of the wider Enochic tradition. It shows that ancient Jewish writers were not only interested in the Watcher's sin, they were also interested in the fate of the giants, their awareness of guilt, and the inevitability of judgment. But the next detail is rarely discussed. Genesis 6 never clearly says the Nephilim were created by angels. It says the sons of God came to the daughters of men. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The relationship between those two statements has been debated for centuries. Ancient text, Genesis says, "These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." That phrase changes the mood. Mighty men, men of name, not merely enormous creatures, not necessarily monsters in the modern sense. Possible interpretation. Some interpreters have suggested the passage may preserve a memory of ancient warrior aristocracies, violent rulers, dynastic heroes, men whose reputations became larger than life. In that reading, the giants are not only bodies of abnormal height, they are political beings enlarged by fear, legend, and inherited power. But Enoch refuses to soften them. In Enoch, the giants are destructive beings whose origin is tied to angelic rebellion. Their size is part of the terror, but not the deepest terror. The deeper terror is that they should not exist at all. This creates the real twist. The question may not be simply, who built the giants? The sharper question is, what kind of world had to be imagined for giants to become necessary? Mainstream scholarly view. Many scholars see the Enochic giant story as a mythic explanation for evil before the flood. It gives evil a genealogy. It traces violence backward until it reaches a forbidden crossing between heaven and earth. That is why the Watchers matter more than the giants. The giants are the evidence, the Watchers are the cause, and the forbidden knowledge is the mechanism that spreads the damage. So, the title of the mystery turns inside out. Enoch does expose who built the giants before the flood, but it also exposes why they were built in the imagination of ancient writers, to explain a world where violence felt too old, too organized, and too powerful to have begun with ordinary human weakness immediately. A larger question rises. If the giants were the visible form of a broken cosmic order, then why do so many ancient cultures preserve stories of semi-divine beings, catastrophic floods, and dangerous knowledge from before the world was remade? The modern connection begins with a warning. No archaeological discovery has proven that supernatural giants walked the earth before the flood. No skeleton has been verified as belonging to the giant offspring of angels. No inscription has been found that says the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon. That separation matters. Ancient text is not the same as historical evidence, but the strange power of Enoch lies in how many ancient themes gather around the same dark center. A world before catastrophe, beings who come from above, forbidden knowledge, violent heroes, a flood that ends an age. Some researchers have noted that these patterns appear across the ancient Near East. The similarities are intriguing, although no consensus exists about what they mean. Historical evidence. In Mesopotamian tradition, ancient stories speak of a time before the flood when extraordinary sages, known as Apkallu, brought knowledge to human civilization. They are associated with wisdom, ritual, writing, and the ordering of society in some later traditions. These beings belong to a remote age before catastrophe. The comparison is not exact. The Apkallu are not the Watchers. Mesopotamian sages are not identical to Enoch's fallen angels. But the resemblance raises a careful question. Why did ancient cultures so often place dangerous knowledge before a flood in Enoch? The Watchers teach metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, and astrology. In Mesopotamian memory, primeval sages transmit arts of civilization. In both cases, knowledge comes from a realm beyond ordinary human life. Possible interpretation. This has led a few scholars to compare the Watchers with older traditions about divine or semi-divine culture bringers. The difference is moral. In some traditions, sacred knowledge organizes the world. In Enoch, unauthorized knowledge corrupts it. The same gift becomes dangerous when it crosses the wrong boundary. But that was only the beginning. Anthropology adds another layer. Across many societies, stories of giants appear near the edges of memory. They are ancestors, enemies, builders, warriors, beings from an earlier age. Sometimes they explain massive ruins. Sometimes they explain old bones. Sometimes they mark the difference between the present world and a more chaotic past. Historical evidence. Ancient people often encountered large stone structures whose builders were forgotten. City walls, burial mounds, megaliths, and ruined platforms could appear almost impossible to later communities without modern archaeology. The simplest explanation was often mythic. Someone greater built this, someone older, someone not quite like us. This does not mean giants actually built the ruins. It means giant traditions often emerge where memory breaks and stone remains. A wall outlives its makers. A legend enters the silence. The evidence becomes more complicated when we turn back to the biblical world. The Hebrew Bible mentions groups remembered for great size or fearsome reputation: the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Ammam, the Zamzummim. These names appear in conquest traditions and territorial memories. They are not always explained the same way. Sometimes they are enemies. Sometimes they are ancestral shadows. Sometimes they are almost ghost-like remnants of an older world. Mainstream scholarly view. Most historians treat these references as part of ancient Israel's memory of formidable peoples in the land. Height may be involved, but the language also serves a literary function. It makes enemies appear terrifying. It enlarges the scale of conflict. It turns geography into memory in that world. A giant is never just a tall person. A giant is what fear looks like when history becomes legend. But Enoch's account does something sharper. It links giants to moral collapse before the flood. It makes them the offspring of rebellion, then connects their violence to the suffering of the earth itself. Here, geology enters only as comparison, not confirmation. Many ancient cultures preserved flood traditions. Mesopotamia has the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Hebrew Bible has Noah. Greek tradition remembers Deucalion. Flood stories appear in many regions, shaped by local landscapes and religious meaning. Historical evidence. Human communities have always lived near rivers, coasts, deltas, and floodplains. Floods were not abstract symbols. They were lived disasters. Water erased houses. Mud swallowed fields. Bodies disappeared beneath currents. After the flood, the land smelled of silt, rot, and broken wood. So it is not surprising that ancient people made flood stories central to their understanding of judgment, renewal, and cosmic reset. Possible interpretation. Enoch may preserve one particular Jewish answer to a wider ancient question. Why would a world need to be destroyed? Genesis says violence filled the earth. Enoch asks where that violence came from. Then it gives violence a genealogy. Watchers, forbidden knowledge, giants, bloodshed, judgment. Another modern field adds a final comparison. Linguistics shows how names and categories shift across traditions. The Hebrew term Nephilim has long been debated. Some connect it with a root meaning to fall. Others caution that ancient etymology is difficult and that later interpretation may shape how the word was understood. This is where historians disagree. Were the Nephilim fallen ones? Were they those who caused others to fall? Were they simply legendary warriors whose name later became associated with giants? Enoch chooses one path and expands it into a cosmic drama. Mainstream scholarly view. Modern scholarship generally does not treat Enoch as a factual report of angelic biology. It treats the text as ancient apocalyptic literature. That means it reveals how a community understood evil, history, divine judgment, and hidden knowledge. But this does not make the text unimportant. It makes it more revealing, because Enoch shows us what ordinary explanation could not handle. Violence before the flood was not described as random. It was traced upward. It began when beings assigned to watch crossed the line they were meant to guard. And if that is symbolic, the symbol is still powerful. Those who were supposed to protect creation became the ones who damaged it. Those who possessed knowledge became the ones who misused it. Those who came from the heights produced creatures that dragged the world downward. So modern research does not prove Enoch's giants, but it does help explain why the story endured. It stands at the meeting point of archaeology, myth, memory, and moral imagination. And the next question is unavoidable. If Enoch was so influential, so ancient, and so deeply tied to the mystery of Genesis, why did most later readers never encounter it inside the Bible they inherited? The hidden history of Enoch is not the story of one book being buried by one institution. It is more complicated and more revealing. The Book of Enoch lived in different worlds at different times. In some communities, it was treasured. In others, it was questioned. In many places, it gradually disappeared from ordinary reading, not because every copy was destroyed, but because canons formed, languages changed, and religious authorities made different judgments about which texts should define doctrine. Ancient text. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament appears to quote or version Enoch directly, saying that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied judgment against the ungodly. That is a remarkable survival. A voice from Enoch enters a Christian text that later becomes canonical. But that does not mean the whole Book of Enoch became scripture for most Christian communities. Historical evidence. In the early centuries of Christianity, some writers knew Enoch and valued it. Tertullian, writings round the late 2nd and early 3rd century, defended its usefulness. Other church figures were more cautious. Over time, as biblical canons became more fixed in Greek and Latin Christianity, Enoch moved to the margins. The reasons were not simple. The text was ancient, but its status was debated. It explained Genesis, but it also added details not found in Genesis. It described angels, forbidden knowledge, giants, and evil spirits with an intensity that later theologians did not always want to treat as authoritative. This is where history becomes quieter, not dramatic, just decisive. Books survive when communities keep copying them. If a text is not read in worship, not taught in schools, not copied by scribes, and not preserved in the languages of power, it can vanish from one tradition while remaining alive in another. That is what happened to Enoch. Mainstream scholarly view. Most Jewish and Christian canons did not include Mar Enoch. Rabbinic Judaism did not preserve it as scripture. Greek and Latin Christianity did not keep it in the standard Old Testament or New Testament collections. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved one Enoch in its biblical tradition. In the Ge'ez language, that fact changed everything. For centuries, much of the wider world knew Enoch only through references, quotations, and rumors. Then European scholars encountered Ethiopic manuscripts. The lost book had not been lost everywhere. It had been carried in another archive, across mountains, across liturgies, across centuries of careful copying, possible interpretation. This history matters because it changes how we think about forbidden texts. Sometimes a text is not forbidden in the simple sense. Sometimes it is displaced, preserved by one community, rejected by another, ignored by a third, and rediscovered by outsiders who suddenly realize the margins have been guarding an ancient memory. But Enoch's controversy did not end with rediscovery. The Watcher's story still disturbed interpreters. Did angels have bodies? Could spiritual beings produce children? Were demons the spirits of dead giants? Was forbidden knowledge literally taught by heavenly rebels? Or were these ancient images for political corruption, imperial violence, and the misuse of sacred wisdom? Different traditions answered differently, and each answer changed the meaning of the giants. Ancient text. In Enoch, the guilt falls heavily on the watchers. They descend, they desire, they swear, they teach, they produce beings who tear the world apart. Historical evidence in later interpretation. Some readers softened or reinterpreted the sons of God in Genesis 6. Instead of angels, They identified them as human rulers, descendants of Seth, or members of a corrupt elite. These interpretations reduced the problem of angelic embodiment. They made the passage easier to fit into later theology, but they also changed the architecture of the mystery. If the sons of God were human rulers, then the giants become symbols of tyranny. If they were descendants of Seth marrying into Cain's line, then the story becomes a warning about moral compromise. If they were angels, as Enoch presents them, then the story becomes a cosmic rebellion whose consequences enter human history. Mainstream scholarly view? Modern scholars generally examine these interpretations as layers of reception history. They ask how the same short passage in Genesis produced multiple competing explanations. Enoch is one of the oldest and most developed of those explanations, but it was not the only one. That is why the Book of Enoch remains so powerful. It preserves a road not taken by most later biblical tradition, a road where the origin of violence is not merely human weakness. It is a rupture between worlds. The next detail is rarely discussed. The rediscovery of Enoch did not simply restore an old story about giants. It helped scholars understand the religious world between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. A world of apocalyptic visions, heavenly journeys, angelic names, cosmic judgment, written secrets, calendars, demons, final reckoning. Without Enoch, that world looks thinner. With Enoch, it becomes charged with voices that were almost forgotten. And those voices explain why the giants mattered. They were not only monsters before the flood. They were proof that creation had been invaded by disorder. They were the bodies of a theological crisis, possible interpretation. The hidden history of Enoch shows that memory does not disappear evenly. It travels by unexpected roads. A book can vanish from the libraries of one empire and survive in the churches of another. A story can be judged too strange for one canon and too sacred to abandon in another. So when people ask why Enoch was forgotten, the better question may be this: who remembered it, and what did they understand that others allowed to fade? So what can be said with confidence? Ancient text. The Book of Enoch says, "The giants came from the Watchers." These beings descended to earth, took human women, revealed forbidden knowledge, and produced violent offspring who devastated the world before the flood. That is the text's claim. It is direct, it is unsettling, and it is far more detailed than Genesis. Historical evidence. Historians know that Enoch was an ancient Jewish work, not a modern invention. Parts of the Enochic tradition circulated before Christianity. Fragments survived among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Later, the full book remained preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, long after it disappeared from many Jewish, Greek, and Latin Christian settings. That is the historical foundation. But the mystery does not end there. Mainstream scholarly view. Most scholars do not treat Enoch as a literal field report from the world before the flood. They read it as apocalyptic literature. It uses visions, angels, cosmic geography, judgment scenes, and symbolic history to explain why evil seems older than ordinary human choice. In that reading, the giants are not just monsters. They are evidence that the world, in Enoch's imagination, had been broken from above. Possible interpretation. If the story was intended literally, it raises extraordinary questions about how ancient people imagined heaven, earth, bodies, spirits, and forbidden descent. If it was symbolic, it remains just as powerful, because then the giants represent something history knows very well: violence that grows too large, power that feeds on the weak, knowledge separated from conscience, rulers who become bigger than human beings in memory because their damage outlives them. That may be why the story endured, not because every reader agreed on what the giants were, but because the question behind them never disappeared. Where does destructive power come from? Why does knowledge become dangerous? And what happens when those assigned to guard the boundary become the first to cross it? The Book of Enoch never gives a modern answer. It gives an ancient warning before the flood. The greatest threat was not only the giants walking across the earth. It was the broken order that made them possible.